What was supposed to be a routine appearance on The View reportedly turned into a tense exchange involving Tom Hardy and Joy Behar, ending with Hardy walking away from the interview. The conversation began with the usual questions about his work, but the tone reportedly changed when the discussion moved toward more personal and controversial subjects. Hardy appeared unwilling to continue on those terms, while Behar maintained that she was simply doing her job as a host. Within moments, the conversation became a disagreement over boundaries, professionalism, and what should be discussed on television. Other members of the panel were drawn into the exchange as both sides defended their positions. But what exactly caused the interview to go in this direction, and why did Hardy ultimately decide to leave? To understand that, we need to go back to the beginning of the conversation, before the disagreement became the focus of the entire interview. Tom Hardy's appearance on The View was expected to be a standard promotional interview. Like many actors visiting daytime television, he was there to discuss his latest work, answer questions about his career, and speak with the hosts in front of a studio audience. There was no obvious reason to expect the conversation to become difficult. Joy Behar was leading much of the discussion, while Whoopi Goldberg and Haines were also part of the panel. The format was familiar. Introduce the guest, discuss his current projects, and then move into broader questions about his career and experiences. At first, the conversation appeared to follow that structure. But as the discussion continued, the focus reportedly shifted away from Hardy's professional work and towards subjects he was less comfortable addressing. That change became important because Hardy appeared to believe the interview was moving in a direction he had not expected. Behar, meanwhile, approached the conversation from the perspective of a television host asking questions that she considered relevant to the audience. Neither side appeared willing to completely change its position. What followed was not simply a disagreement over one question. The conversation developed into a larger argument about privacy, interviewing methods, and the responsibilities of both guests and hosts. As the tension increased, the other panelists began taking notice, and the atmosphere in the studio became increasingly uncomfortable. To understand why Hardy eventually walked away from the interview, it is important to start with the moment when the conversation first began to change. The interview began in the way most promotional appearances do. Tom Hardy was introduced as the guest, and the initial focus was expected to remain on his acting career and current projects. Joy Behar welcomed him and started the conversation with questions connected to his work, giving Hardy an opportunity to discuss the professional side of his appearance. For the first part of the exchange, there was no clear indication that the interview would become controversial. Hardy answered the questions and remained involved in the conversation, while Behar continued with the interview in a familiar television format. Whoopi Goldberg and Haines were also present on the panel, listening as the discussion developed. The audience appeared to be expecting an ordinary celebrity interview rather than a disagreement. However, the tone reportedly began to change as Behar moved beyond Hardy's latest project and started asking broader questions. Hardy's responses became more reserved, suggesting that he was becoming less comfortable with the direction of the conversation. That distinction became important. Hardy was there to promote his work, while the hosts were interested in discussing topics that could give viewers more insight into the person behind the actor. At this stage, there was still an opportunity for the interview to continue without any major problem. But the change in subject created the first clear point of tension. Hardy appeared to question where the conversation was heading, while Behar continued with her questions. What seemed like a normal interview was beginning to develop into a disagreement over what was appropriate to discuss, setting the stage for the confrontation that followed. The first clear change in the conversation came when Joy Behar moved away from Hardy's current work and asked about a more personal subject. The question was presented as part of the broader conversation, but Hardy did not appear to see it that way. Instead of answering directly, he questioned why the subject was relevant to the interview. His concern was that the discussion had moved beyond his professional career and into an area he had not expected to address during a promotional appearance. Behar maintained that personal questions can sometimes help audiences understand a celebrity beyond their work. From her perspective, asking about a guest's experiences can be part of a normal television interview, particularly when those experiences have previously received public attention. Hardy, however, appeared to disagree with that approach. He suggested that there was a difference between discussing his career and being asked about private matters simply because they could attract attention. The exchange remained verbal, but the tone had changed. The friendly introduction was no longer the focus. Instead, Hardy and Behar were now discussing the boundaries of the interview itself. Whoopi Goldberg and Haines listened as the disagreement developed, while the conversation became more difficult to steer back toward Hardy's film. Neither side seemed ready to completely change its position. Behar wanted to continue the interview, while Hardy wanted the discussion to return to subjects he considered appropriate. That disagreement created the central tension of the appearance. What started as one uncomfortable question was beginning to raise a larger issue about privacy, interview boundaries, and what a celebrity guest should reasonably expect when appearing on a television program. Hardy did not simply answer the question and move on. Instead, he pushed back on the way the interview was developing. He made it clear that he was uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation and questioned whether the subject was necessary for a discussion that had originally been presented as a promotional appearance. Behar defended her approach. From her perspective, asking challenging questions was part of the job, and she did not appear willing to avoid a subject simply because it made the guest uncomfortable. She attempted to explain that the purpose was to have a broader conversation rather than focus only on Hardy's latest project. Hardy disagreed. He argued that there was a difference between asking relevant questions and bringing private matters into a public discussion. His responses became shorter and more direct, while Behar continued to defend the interview format. The disagreement also began to involve the wider role of the program. Hardy suggested that television interviews sometimes place too much emphasis on controversy because difficult questions can generate stronger reactions from viewers. Behar rejected that characterization and maintained that the hosts were simply asking questions. At this point, the conversation was no longer mainly about Hardy's film. It had become a discussion about the responsibilities of both sides, what a host should ask and what a guest should be prepared to answer. The other panelists could see that the exchange was becoming increasingly difficult to manage. Whoopi Goldberg remained attentive, while Haines appeared to be waiting for an opportunity to help move the discussion forward. But Hardy's decision to challenge the interview directly meant that the disagreement was unlikely to disappear with the next question. As the disagreement between Tom Hardy and Joy Behar continued, Whoopi Goldberg stepped into the conversation. At this stage, the discussion had moved well beyond the original topic, and it was becoming increasingly difficult for Behar to bring the interview back to Hardy's work. Goldberg attempted to lower the tension by encouraging both sides to take a step back. Her role was important because the disagreement was no longer limited to one question. Hardy was criticizing the direction of the interview, while Behar was defending her approach as a host. Goldberg reminded Hardy that he was appearing on a television program where difficult questions were part of the format. She also made the point that disagreement did not have to turn into a personal confrontation. Hardy, however, remained critical. He argued that his concern was not simply about being asked an uncomfortable question. His objection was to what he believed was the broader way the program handled sensitive subjects involving its guests. Goldberg pushed back on that characterization. She explained that the hosts regularly spoke with people holding different opinions and that disagreement was part of the program. In her view, challenging a guest did not automatically mean that the hosts were acting unfairly. The exchange placed Goldberg in the position of trying to restore some balance while Hardy and Behar continued defending their respective positions. Haines also remained involved in the discussion, watching for an opportunity to redirect the conversation. But the intervention did not immediately solve the problem. Instead, it became clear that Hardy was not prepared to simply move on. His criticism was now directed at the way the show conducted interviews, while Behar continued defending the program's approach. The disagreement was becoming larger than the original question. The disagreement became more direct as neither Tom Hardy nor Joy Behar appeared willing to back away from their positions. What had started as a discussion about the direction of the interview was now focused on how each side believed the other was handling the situation. Behar argued that Hardy was reacting too strongly to questions that were part of a normal television conversation. She maintained that asking difficult questions did not mean the program was trying to attack him personally. From her perspective, the interview could continue if Hardy was willing to discuss the subjects calmly. Hardy continued to disagree. He argued that the issue was not simply whether the questions were difficult, but whether certain personal matters belonged in the conversation at all. He wanted the discussion to return to his professional work, while Behar believed the audience had a reason to hear more than prepared promotional answers. As the exchange continued, the tone became increasingly uncomfortable. Hardy's responses became more forceful, and Behar became more direct in defending herself and the program. The other hosts were now clearly aware that the interview was no longer following its original format. Whoopi Goldberg attempted to keep the discussion under control, while Haines tried to find a way to redirect the conversation. The studio audience also appeared to sense the change. What had begun as a normal celebrity appearance was now centered almost entirely on the disagreement between Hardy and Behar. At this point, the central issue was no longer one particular question. It was whether Hardy felt the interview had crossed a boundary and whether Behar believed she was simply doing her job. And as both sides continued defending their positions, the possibility of returning to a normal promotional interview became increasingly unlikely. The disagreement then moved beyond Joy Behar and toward the program itself. Tom Hardy began questioning the way The View handled difficult conversations, arguing that his concerns were not limited to one question or one host. Hardy suggested that television programs can sometimes focus heavily on controversy because strong reactions attract attention. He questioned whether guests were always given enough control over how personal subjects were discussed once the cameras were on. Behar rejected that criticism. She argued that asking challenging questions was part of the responsibility of a television host, and that guests could not expect every conversation to remain focused only on promotion. She also maintained that questioning a public figure did not automatically mean the program was trying to create conflict. The disagreement became more difficult to resolve because both sides were now defending broader principles. Hardy was emphasizing personal boundaries and the right of a guest to object to certain topics. Behar was emphasizing the role of an interviewer and the audience's expectation of an open conversation. Whoopi Goldberg again attempted to keep the discussion from becoming personal. She pointed out that disagreements could happen without turning the interview into an argument. Haines also tried to bring the conversation back toward a more constructive discussion. But Hardy continued to challenge the show's approach. His criticism was now directed at the way the panel conducted interviews rather than simply at Behar's question. That shift changed the nature of the conversation. It was no longer just a guest objecting to an uncomfortable subject. Hardy was questioning the program's interviewing style, while the hosts were defending their professionalism. With both sides becoming more firmly established in their positions, the tension continued to build and the interview moved closer to a point where someone would have to end the exchange. The conversation reached its most difficult point when neither Tom Hardy nor Joy Behar appeared willing to change direction. Hardy continued arguing that the interview had crossed a personal boundary, while Behar maintained that she was simply doing her job and asking questions relevant to the audience. The disagreement became more direct. Behar told Hardy that he needed to either continue the conversation respectfully or reconsider whether he wanted to remain on the program. Hardy viewed the response as another attempt to dismiss his concerns rather than address them. Whoopi Goldberg stepped in again, encouraging Hardy to calm down and reminding him that the discussion was taking place on television. Haines also tried to move the conversation toward a more constructive exchange. Instead of settling the disagreement, those attempts appeared to make the central issue clearer. Hardy believed the hosts were refusing to acknowledge his concerns, while the hosts believed Hardy was allowing his frustration to take over the interview. The studio atmosphere became noticeably uncomfortable. The focus was no longer on Hardy's film or career. Everyone was now watching to see whether the disagreement could be resolved or whether the interview would have to end. Behar eventually made it clear that she was not prepared to continue an exchange that she felt had become disrespectful. Hardy, meanwhile, remained firm in his criticism of the program and its approach. At that moment, the interview had reached a point where continuing normally seemed difficult. The disagreement had gone beyond a difference of opinion and had become a question of whether Hardy and the panel could remain in the same conversation. The next decision would determine how the appearance ended: continue the argument, end the interview, or have Hardy leave the set. The interview eventually reached a point where continuing the conversation no longer seemed productive. Joy Behar made it clear that she did not want the disagreement to continue in the same way, while Tom Hardy remained dissatisfied with how the discussion had developed. Rather than continuing to argue, Hardy decided to end his participation in the interview. He made it clear that he was not prepared to remain in a conversation where he believed his concerns were being ignored. Behar maintained that Hardy had been given an opportunity to discuss his work and that the disagreement had developed because of his reaction to the questions. She did not appear willing to accept responsibility for the conflict, while Hardy continued to stand by his decision to leave. Whoopi Goldberg attempted one more time to keep the situation under control, but the conversation had already reached its limit. Haines also tried to move things toward a calmer conclusion, but Hardy appeared to have made up his mind. He stood up, ended the exchange, and walked away from the interview area. The departure immediately changed the atmosphere in the studio. What had started as a standard promotional appearance had ended without the usual closing questions or a conventional goodbye. Behar and the other hosts were left to deal with the sudden change in the program. The audience was also left trying to understand how an interview that began normally had reached this point. Hardy's decision to leave became the clearest sign that the disagreement could not be resolved on air. Whether viewers saw the move as a reasonable decision to end an uncomfortable conversation or as an unnecessary escalation depended largely on how they interpreted the exchange. Either way, the interview was over, and attention quickly shifted to what would happen after Hardy walked off the set. After Tom Hardy walked away, the atmosphere in the studio changed immediately. The conversation that had been centered on the disagreement suddenly stopped, leaving Joy Behar, Whoopi Goldberg, and Haines to decide how to continue the program. Behar remained at the table and appeared focused on regaining control of the discussion. She had spent the previous part of the interview defending her questions and the show's approach, so Hardy's departure left the panel with an unexpected situation to manage. Goldberg and Haines also had to respond to what had just happened. Neither appeared to have expected the interview to end that way, and the attention of the studio audience was now focused on the hosts rather than the scheduled discussion. For the audience, the sudden departure created an obvious question. What had caused the conversation to deteriorate so quickly? Some viewers could interpret Hardy's decision as an attempt to end a discussion he no longer wanted to continue, while others could see it as an unnecessary reaction to normal interview questions. The hosts eventually attempted to move the program forward, but the earlier disagreement remained the main focus. A planned discussion about Hardy's work had been replaced by questions about the interview itself and the decision to walk away. In the scenario described by this script, the incident would also create immediate attention outside the studio. Viewers would likely discuss the exchange, revisit the comments made by both sides, and debate whether either party had handled the disagreement appropriately. What had started as a promotional appearance had therefore ended with the guest leaving before the interview could reach its planned conclusion. The next question was no longer what Hardy came to promote, but what the confrontation could mean for everyone involved. The fallout from the interview would largely depend on how viewers interpreted the disagreement. Tom Hardy could be seen as a guest who decided to leave after becoming uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. At the same time, Joy Behar and the other hosts could argue that challenging questions are a normal part of television interviews and that Hardy could have handled his concerns without ending the appearance. The most important issue would be determining where the conversation crossed the line. Was Hardy justified in objecting when the discussion moved toward personal subjects, or should he have continued the interview and addressed the questions directly? On the other side, did Behar simply perform her role as an interviewer, or did the discussion move further into personal territory than Hardy expected? Those questions would likely become the main focus of the reactions surrounding the appearance. Instead of viewers discussing Hardy's film or upcoming work, attention would center on the disagreement and his decision to walk away. The incident would also raise a broader question about celebrity interviews. Public figures are often expected to answer difficult questions, but they may also have boundaries concerning private matters. Television hosts, meanwhile, have to balance those boundaries with the audience's interest in hearing honest and direct answers. That is what makes the confrontation significant within the story. There is no simple answer about who was completely right or wrong. Both Hardy and Behar had their own perspective on what the interview should have been. So the question remains, was Hardy right to walk away, or did the situation become more serious than it needed to be? In the end, the interview left more questions than answers. Tom Hardy came to the view for what was expected to be a straightforward conversation about his work, but the discussion reportedly moved into areas that made him uncomfortable and eventually led him to leave the set. Joy Behar maintained her position as a host asking questions for the audience, while Hardy made it clear that he believed certain subjects should have remained outside the conversation. Whoopi Goldberg and Haines attempted to keep the discussion under control, but neither side was able to completely resolve the disagreement. That leaves the central question for viewers. Was Tom Hardy justified in walking away, or should he have handled the disagreement differently? And what about Joy Behar? Was she simply doing her job as an interviewer, or did the conversation go further than Hardy expected? There are different ways to interpret what happened, and the answer may depend on where you believe the boundary between a tough interview and a personal confrontation should be. Let me know what you think in the comments. If you were in Hardy's position, would you have stayed and answered the questions, or would you have walked away? And if you want to follow more stories about unexpected celebrity interviews and television confrontations, make sure to stay tuned for the next one.